Hello, my name is Özer. In this video, I'll be presenting our work investigating non-negative autoencoders for efficient audio decomposition. The co-authors are Hansen, Zunner, and Professor Müller. We are with International Audio Laboratories Erlangen, Germany, which are a joint institution of Friedrich Alexander University Erlangen-Nuremberg and Fraunhofer Institute for Integrated Circuits. In this work, our focus is audio decomposition, which is a very well-known task in music information retrieval. Audio decomposition defines the process of decomposition of a complex sound mixture into its constituent components. Particularly, given the magnitude spectrogram of a music recording, the purpose is to encode spectral patterns, as known as templates, and their occurrences in time, as known as activations. Score representations can be integrated to guide the decomposition process. In this figure, we see the decomposition of the magnitude spectrogram of an excerpt of Chopin's Prelude, Opus 28, number 4 in E minor, into its template and activation matrices. The information related to the note number 71, which is B4, is indicated by the red rectangular frames. Non-negative matrix factorization, as known as NMF, is a prominent low-rank factorization method that imposes non-negativity constraints in all the matrices involved. Notably, its effectiveness to yield interpretable results have attracted great attention, and it was successfully used for audio decomposition. In the context of audio decomposition, given the magnitude spectrogram of a music recording, shown as the V matrix, and a target rank R, which is much smaller than the input matrix dimensions K and N, NMF seeks an optimal approximation enforcing non-negativity in the both learned matrices W and H. For the decomposition of music recordings, one also can introduce further musically plausible constraints which guide the learning process. Here, we see the initialization process for the Prelude by Chopin. On the left-hand side, we see the initialization of the templates using a sparse harmonic model. This constrains the undesired frequencies in the template matrix, as zero values remain zero across the optimization. Similarly, using the score information, activations can also be constrained. In the figure, we show the initialization for the pitch number 55. We now show how the constrained NMF model can be simulated via a non-negative autoencoder denoted as NAE. Here, we formulate the NMF model as a linear autoencoder, which has two fully connected layers. The matrix WE denotes the encoder, which yields the activation matrix H, also called the code matrix, as output. The decoder WD can be thought as the equivalent of the template matrix W in the NMF case. Note that the NMF model learns activation matrix H and the templates W, whereas the NAE learns the encoder matrix WE and the decoder matrix WD. This means that the activations are indirectly learned in the case of NAEs. To ensure the non-negativity of the templates and activations, similar to the NMF case, it's required to additionally introduce non-negativity constraints. Our proposed non-negative autoencoder applies a rectified linear unit, as known as ReLU, following the encoder layer to ensure the non-negativity of the activations. For the non-negativity of the decoder matrix, WD, we use a projected gradient descent method. Our experiments show that applying a simple ReLU after the encoder layer results in a better convergence than using projected gradients for the encoder as well. As for the NMF case, we integrate prior musical knowledge into the NAE model to guide the learning process. Here, we use the structured dropout for activity constraints, introduced by Ewert and Sandler. Dropout layers typically regularize networks to avoid overfitting by randomly setting neurons to 0. In contrast, structured dropout imposes prior musical knowledge and selectively removes the undesired activations. To enforce a harmonic model for the template weights, WD, we add further projection by applying binary masking on the decoder. To train our models, we use the Frobenius norm as the loss function. Similar to the NMF case, one can train non-negative autoencoders using alternating least squares optimization. This defines the optimization procedure where the decoder matrix WD is updated with the fixed encoder matrix WE, and then WE is updated with the fixed WD, and so on. Based upon the alternating least squares approach, we train our non-negative autoencoder models with additive methods such as stochastic gradient descent, root mean square optimization, as known as RMS Proc, and adaptive moment optimization, as known as ADAM. It's important to note that stochastic gradient descent uses a constant learning rate, whereas RMS Proc and ADAM adjust the learning rate during training, which enhances and accelerates the convergence. In their seminal paper, Algorithms for Non-Negative Matrix Factorization, Lee and Seung introduced multiplicative update rules for the optimization of NMF. Throughout this work, we refer to this model as the multiplicative NMF. The crucial idea here is using an adaptive learning rate which transforms the additive update rules of the usual gradient descent method to multiplicative ones. This results in the equations on the left-hand side. These equations are based on the Euclidean laws. The machine epsilon is added in the denominator to avoid division by 0. Based upon this approach, Zunner derived the multiplicative update rules for non-negative autoencoders, which we call multiplicative NAE. Note that this derivation additionally involves the structured dropout for the activations, which selectively removes undesired activations. As for the multiplicative NMF, the multiplicative NAE has the property that zero-valued entries remain 0. Now, we report on our experiments where we compare NAE-based models with the score-informed NMF model used as the reference. To this end, we decomposed the magnitude spectrograms of piano recordings into spectral vectors and their activations. As the dataset, we use 8 publicly available piano recordings given in the link. The initialization process is identical for each NAE and the reference NMF model. We performed 10,000 iterations in the training phase, where we regard an iteration to be the update of both the matrices W and H in the NMF case and WE and WD in the NAE case. To get a first impression of the approximation behavior, we compare the learned template and activation matrices. In the red-blue colored visualizations, we see the difference between the learned matrices by the NAE models and the NMF reference. One also can see that the multiplicative NAE reveals similar template and activation matrices as the NMF reference. Among the additive NAE-based approaches, the NAE variant trained with stochastic gradient descent leads to the worst result compared to the NMF reference. One also can conclude that NAEs trained with adaptive gradient descent methods lead to template and activation matrices close to the NMF case. Now, we compare the approximation quality of various decompositions quantitatively. The table shows a comparison of approximation errors between the input matrix V and the approximation matrix V hat yielded by the NMF reference and various NAE-based approaches. Here, each entry indicates the average column-wise L1 error between the approximation matrix and the input spectrogram. Among the NAE variants, RMS prop reaches the smallest approximation error, whereas the reference multiplicative NMF leads to the best approximation. Moreover, we can infer that the reference NMF model and various NAE-based approaches perform similarly over the whole dataset. In our next experiment, we report on the convergence behavior of all approaches over the number of iterations. The figure illustrates the mean and standard deviations per iteration over the column-wise Euclidean error, evaluated using all the piano recordings in the dataset. The rapid decay in error after first iteration of the multiplicative models is remarkable, whereas additive NAE variants need more iterations until they reach a steeper decline in error. NAE with stochastic gradient descent shows a slow and unstable convergence behavior, which results in a poor approximation even after 10,000 iterations. In contrast, NAE with Adam converts after 10,000 iterations to a similar decomposition as NMF, whereas NAE trained with RMS prop achieves this convergence only after 1,000 iterations. Finally, we report on the training runtime of the multiplicative NAE and the NAE trained with RMS prop. Although the multiplicative NAE shows a very steep decay after the first iteration, NAE trained with RMS prop on GPU outperforms the multiplicative model after around 100 seconds. Furthermore, the gradient computation of the multiplicative NAE becomes challenging in the case of deeper models. On the other hand, the implementation of NAE RMS prop can exploit the automatic gradient computation of deep learning frameworks. Using GPUs, one also can accelerate the convergence, which becomes more evident in the case of deeper models. In this work, we simulated the score-informed NMF via non-negative autoencoders. We explored different adaptive gradient descent methods, including the multiplicative update rules for NAEs. We have shown that the GPU-accelerated adaptive RMS prop method overperformed all the other NAE variants. In the future, we aim to design more complex models which preserves interpretability. We hope that this will enable the design of explainable deep learning models. Thanks for watching. I would be delighted to meet you in person at the poster session in Belgrade.